One of the most verifiable events in all of history is the flood of Noah.
I thought Christians said lying was a sin, and you get sent to hell, right? Oh yeah, I'm forgetting one very important thing here. You get a free pass if you believe. Duh. But what if he's right about the Great Flood? Well, he specifically said one of the most verifiable events in all of history. Even if the Great Flood happened, it is far from verifiable, let alone one of the most verifiable. Which is most certainly wrong. But let's hear Matt out. Maybe he has made some crazy discovery here. Maybe I'm judging Matt too harshly, just like God did when he flooded the earth.
Many people believe that it's a myth, that Noah was a mythical man that never existed. Well, in this seminar, I'm going to give you a very strong defense of Noah's Ark. This is the case for Noah's flood. In the center of the United States, we find hundreds and hundreds of dinosaur graveyards. Each one of these dots that you can see represents a graveyard that contains sometimes hundreds of thousands of fossils. How did a wave from the oceanic coast, hundreds of miles away, make it all the way to the center of the United States to be able to bury hundreds of thousands of dinosaurs with fish, sea life, and crustaceans all together in one event?
They didn't die all in one event. It's easy to confuse people with dinosaurs because when many imagine them, they were ruling the earth all at the same time. Which, if our impression is like that, then it matches Matt Powell's belief. So he can use it to work for him, like he is here. However, something that is important to remember is that it's more accurate to imagine a T-Rex in our cities than it is to imagine a T-Rex hunting a stegosaur. Stegos went extinct 150 million years ago, whereas T-Rex emerged around 69 million years ago, but died out about 65 million years ago. So T-Rexes were 81 million years after Stegos, but we were only 65 million years away from T-Rexes. So no, they didn't all die at once, and they didn't all coexist. Especially not us. Also, as for that map you showed for the global flood, it's strange we find a high density of fossils in those locations rather than spread out a lot more. It's almost like it's more about the area they died in rather than one big global flood.
The only explanation for that is the flood of Noah. Now, if you examine the dinosaur fossils that are found in these graveyards, you'll often find that they died in an asphyxiated position, meaning that they had suffocated to death.
No, that does not mean that. It certainly can do, but it's also certainly not the only reason. But let's just assume that. By this reasoning, all, at least theropod dinos, should be found like this dating back to the same date. I understand that our dates are very different, but at least our methods should show that we agree those fossils would have the same date, even if different to each other, but agree they died at the same time. Wow, this is Eodromeus, a species that went extinct 230 million years ago, long before the actual extinction event of the dinosaurs, in that same death pose. It's also 3 to 4 times older, which, unless the Great Flood happened about 1,500 years ago, this certainly wouldn't make sense for your 6,000-year-old Earth.
And they had to be buried quickly in silt, otherwise they wouldn't have been preserved to begin with. Because remember, to get a fossil, you have to have rapid burial. And within some of these dinos, we find preserved blood cells. The blood cells have been analyzed by certain scientists, and they found that the dinosaurs died from drowning. We also find collagen. Collagen has a half-life of 400 years. Remember, it's the soft material that's within the bones of these organisms. Check this out. It says scientists find collagen inside a 195 million-year-old bone. It says scientists are still trying to figure out how these protein fragments really managed to last so long in the first place.
Well, I find it interesting that you're making a judgment before allowing the scientists to figure it out. Or is it more that you didn't like their answer, so you're dismissing it? Because if that's the case, why accept that they found collagen and blood cells at all? Can you trust them, or can't you? He is right, though, and surprisingly used the upper limit of the half-life of cartilage collagen, which is about 100 to 400 years. However, I thought he didn't like using half-lives because that's how we aged the dinosaur fossils to begin with. Most commonly, but not the only way with fossils, we use carbon-14. Basically with how much is left compared to how much was expected when the creature died. If the answers based on half-lives doesn't work, then I can't just say, but carbon-14 is just right because I feel better about it. Just like Matt can't because of collagen. That being said, let's try to figure out where the problem is. All of our other methods match closely or exactly to the carbon-14 dating, not collagen. So if collagen is the odd one out, why? As far as I could research, and I'm certainly not a paleontologist, the discovery of collagen and proteins in dinosaur fossils is indeed significant, but comes with caveats. When scientists report findings of proteins, it is often in the form of very degraded fragments, not intact proteins. The preservation of these fragments is extremely rare, and often occurs under exceptional conditions. Current scientific consensus that while these discoveries are remarkable, they are not evidence of completely preserved original biological tissues. Instead, they often represent chemically altered remains or mineralized imprints that provide valuable but indirect evidence about the biology of ancient organisms. So the evidence that actual collagen, proteins, fibers or blood cells are not exactly revolutionary, and they wouldn't even match each other either. The half-life of proteins are in the ranges of days, blood cells have a lifespan of months, but we're not looking at these things exactly as they are. Anything that's been found, as far as I could tell, are either misidentifications, imprints of such things, or fossils themselves, meaning they are not the original object, just like with bones being replaced with minerals and such, but are not exactly bones themselves, anymore at least. I hope that helps, but I'm no expert, so feel free to correct me in the comments section if you have any more information. But please add a way that I can check the information as well. And if you do, then thanks, I greatly appreciate that. This is how we should be learning reality, even if you consider that to be God's work. But we can't end the pursuit of knowledge by saying God did it.
And one of the common things that we find in dinosaur stomachs is grass and ferns. The dinosaurs were buried so quickly that these plants didn't even have time to be digested. We have a dinosaur right here that they call Skippy. It still has its intestines, colon, liver, muscles, and a windpipe. They're not fossilized. They are intact organs.
To be honest, I assume most dinosaurs died while having some food digesting, especially big herbivores, as they almost constantly ate. And some of the food will survive depending on how the dino was preserved. As for Skippy's organs, the soft tissues aren't simple imprints here, which is great, and they are three-dimensional. However, they are also petrifications. Calcium phosphate has replaced the original organic matter in amazing detail, even to the subcellular level, or as transformed remains of the original biomolecular components. So, they are not functioning organs. They are not biological anymore. They are a petrification, which is extremely similar to a fossil. Instead of minerals, they're basically stone. So Matt's technically not lying here, but definitely misunderstanding, or worse, deceiving.
And this is a picture of a mummified nodosaur. It weighs 2,500 pounds and still has intestines. And scientists believe that it was, quote, swept to sea by a flooding river, sank, landed on its back, and pressed into the ocean floor.
The nodosaur that we have a fossil of died about 110 million years ago. I know we disagree on the date itself, but why are all these dates different and Matt claims they died at the same time? It's like having 3 loaves of bread. One is mouldy and the other is fine. The last has disintegrated into dust, and saying they're all the same age. Why? Because God only wanted to keep one loaf. But I am glad you decided to add how the poor creature died. Matt just stated from a flooding river, but earlier, a huge wave from the ocean. Again, Matt, which is it? It could be both, sure. But why did these events happen so far from each other in an even with math's timeline of hundreds of thousands of years?
And one of the common things that we find are clams on the top of Mount Everest, and they're in the closed position. Naturally, when a clam dies, it will open up, the muscle relaxes, and a scavenger comes and eats them. And so when you're at the beach, you'll notice that all of the shells are in 2 parts. These clams that are on the top of Mount Everest are closed. That means that they were catastrophically buried, and then Mount Everest was pushed up through catastrophic plate tectonics, with the clams contained near the peak.
Well, at least Matt isn't trying to say they lived up there, I guess. But why not if God did it? Fossilization usually involves burial that can preserve, so it'd be strange not to find closed clams as fossils at some point. The process of fossilization literally allows it to happen, so that's not really extraordinary. So it's more about sea life fossils being discovered so high up a mountain. It seems like we both agree the mountain was made after the death of the clams, through tectonic plates. However, Matt believes the Earth is only 6,000 years, which clearly makes no sense in this regard, as scientists agree that Mount Everest formed about 60 million years ago. But he completely skips over how he thinks it happens
in such a short time frame.
Other than tectonic plates, it just did. I hope he explains it in this video somewhere though.
And in the mountains of Peru, we find 11-foot wide oysters that weigh over 600 pounds.
I didn't know that. Those oysters are pretty huge. Irrelevant, but it's still pretty awesome, I suppose.
And if you look at them as well, they're also closed, and whatever had buried them had to have been so powerful because they couldn't relax, they couldn't open when they died. They must have been buried by a tremendous amount of sediment. The Bible says 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered.
The mountains. Seriously? Enough water on Earth to fill Earth up over Mount Everest. Where did the water come from and where did it go? That would mean that Noah's boat was higher than Mount Everest. What happened to air pressure? How the were the occupants of the boat even safe based on the air? Either the water was magically placed and gravity increased, creating greater pressure for the surrounding environment, or the water wasn't magically added and came from within, I don't know, or from Earth itself and just rose. How did Noah survive the lack of pressure at that height? If the pressure remained because the water just pushed air up with it, how did the boat survive such extreme storms? Now that's just from the top of my head. What's the point researching when the answer is that God saved them? Which, if that was the case, why get Noah to build an ark in the first place? God could have just saved them and demoed Earth to rebuild after.
We also find whales that are buried in the vertical position. Check out this article. It says near Lompoc, California, an 80-foot whale fossil was found in a diatomaceous earth quarry. It was oriented vertically, standing on its tail, passing through millions of years of strata. Supposedly, rock layers on the Earth take millions of years to slowly accumulate, and Noah's flood could not have been what put these layers here. Well, if you have a whale, basic common sense will tell you if it's connecting all of these layers, then all of these layers are the same age. Because otherwise, if you had part of the whale getting submerged in these lower layers as they were slowly forming, the top part of the whale would have completely rotted off. It would have been eaten by critters and scavengers. The entire whale was preserved from top to bottom.
My guess would be tectonic plate movements shifting the fossils into upright positions, but let's look into it. Here's what I found, basically a better way of saying my guess. The fossil was not vertical. It was 40 to 50 degrees off horizontal, and the fossil was orientated parallel to the strata. In other words, the whale was horizontal when buried. The strata was later uplifted and folded into their present orientation. That took me 5 minutes, Matt. I want my 5 minutes back. Don't worry. I'll probably just waste it.
How does that happen? How does it stand vertically? If these layers are supposedly millions of years of different time zones, gravity would have pulled the whale down flat or on its back. It wouldn't be standing upright.
Stop
if
being so
millions of
biased.
years of geological accumulation of layers was what caused this fossil to come into existence.
Matt, if you want to challenge these things, look it up, find all the information you can, and if any is missing, then yes. I said missing, not ignored. Then you can make a discovery yourself if your hypothesis is correct.
The flood of Noah was a real event that actually happened. And there is no question about that. And this is why the Bible tells us that in the last days, there will be scoffers, people who mock the Bible, people who mock the flood of Noah and say that it never happened.
There have been people debating the legitimacy of the Bible ever since it was written. One of the first Bibles thought to have existed was called the Heretic's Bible, which no copies have ever been found because people destroyed it.
It says, "For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water." The Bible goes on to say that whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So the entire world at one point perished because of the flood of Noah. If you're going to assume that rock layers take millions of years to accumulate, that Noah's flood isn't what placed the whale there, then you have to explain how you get a vertical whale fossil that connects millions of years of supposed geologic time.
I did explain that. It was the easiest part of this video that could be researched to debunk. And just to be clear, it didn't pass through millions of years of strata. They're not straight lines that are all equal in height everywhere in the world. Otherwise, the tip of Mount Everest would be like looking into the future's history and discovering what will have happened in the past. Even that sentence was difficult grammatically.
You have to explain that. The burden of proof is on an evolutionist and an atheist to explain why we find these fossils.
No, it isn't. It's among scientists like paleontologists, who can also be theists. Admittedly, a different version of theism to Matt, but Matt, they do exist. Also, it's not our burden of proof anyway. You can't just make a claim and expect others to take you seriously. I could say I believe in Arceus, made all of the earth and its creatures. However, with the help of Palkia and Dialga, after seeing the evils of humanity, decided to create 4 new dimensions to live alongside us. But we can never perceive them. How else can you explain all the dinosaur fossils at all? The burden of proof is on the theist to explain this. Obviously, I don't believe this, just in case anyone was uncertain.
The only reason that people declare that we descended from slime and from fish is because they're looking at the lower layers of the geologic column and concluding that those are our ancestors, and that this geologic column timescale represents millions of years of slow and gradual accumulation of layers over time. But that is not true.
You're right, it isn't, because I thought it was radiometric dating. The geological formations of sedimentary layers are a good indication of the age, but not how we prove it. We also use other methods of dating to confirm the results to avoid false readings. But let's see when Matt takes the straw man anyway.
If it were true, you wouldn't even find fossils. In National Geographic, in their section on fossils, they state that for an organism to be fossilized, the remains usually need to be covered by sediment soon after death. Sediment can include the sandy seafloor, lava, and even sticky tar. Once again, to get a fossil, it takes very particular conditions. It's not about time. Many people say it takes thousands of years for fossils to form. That's not true. The organism would rot while it's forming. There's no way that it would take thousands of years to even get one fossil. Fossilization is not about time.
The reason a fossil needs to be buried in the first place isn't really about the process of making a fossil, but the preservation of the specimen to be fossilized over that time. While being preserved, even by different means, that's when fossilization can occur. Otherwise, you'd be right in saying that decomposition would act faster. But preservation is what slows that down.
It is about conditions. And if you look at these coal seams here, you will find that there's identical amounts of C14 in each of the coal seams. Now, C14 only lasts 50,000 years, max. How is it that each of these coal seams contains an identical amount of C14? What it shows us is that all of these coal seams are the same age, that they all were formed in one event in rapid succession.
Again, this is just misunderstanding and the unwillingness to research. The edge hasn't been excavated recently. It's a natural structure that's exposed. This exposure allows contamination of C14 that it's being supplied with from the same source. However, why does Matt think his one example, that if it were accurate would have broken the rules or system, means that his logic is true despite the masses of other examples that don't comply to his logic?
Coal comes from vegetation that's been smashed together between sediments, and some of these seams are over 100 feet in thickness. To be able to get a coal seam over 100 feet thick, it requires a global cataclysmic condition. It doesn't require millions of years of time to slowly produce coal. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a coal seam this thick. You would have really tiny coal seams all across the world.
Again, the coal seam doesn't stretch the entirety of the Earth. It is still large areas, but also the fact that there are multiple layers. If the Great Flood caused one layer, how many times has God flooded the Earth? And why aren't these other times written in the Bible?
And one of the more common pieces of evidence that us creationists like to use is polystrata fossils. You can see trees that were catastrophically buried in multiple layers of sediment. Just like the whales that we covered earlier, some of which are found in vertical positions connecting all of these layers of geologic time, we also find trees that go through all of these different layers that connect all of this supposed geologic time.
But your argument for the whales was that they couldn't be buried upright, and now you're presenting things that could easily be buried that way. Trees fossilized this way could have been slowly buried before decomposing, but yes, could also have been rapid burials. But with a great global flood, why weren't they destroyed, or at least uprooted, especially the smaller ones? And I'd like to ask, in the examples you've given, where are the tree's roots? Maybe they weren't preserved by simply being buried. Those ones look like they were torn up and thrown around somewhere maybe. Or maybe they died and fell down and broke down, or something knocked them over. But the answer doesn't seem to point me towards global flood.
And what it shows is that all of these layers were laid down at the same time. How is a tree going to stand in the ground with sediments slowly forming around it for millions of years?
It doesn't show this at all. How is a tree going to have stood without its roots? Considering you're saying that these trees were standing upright and buried rapidly. Seems like the trees here were not buried where they stood originally, but nothing suggesting a global flood still.
Now, an objection that I've heard to this is that these trees were covered by little local floods. But what they won't mention is that many of these trees are found upside down. Trees do not grow upside down, folks. What obviously happened was the tree was ripped out by a literal earthquake. It floated around in the water for some time and then flipped upside down after that it became waterlogged, and it went into the silt. The sediment layers formed around it, and that's what makes the most logical sense when looking at these polystrata fossils.
Oh yeah, that's what obviously happened. Trees don't grow upside down, so therefore earthquakes, global floods, and rapid burials. There's a few jumps in conclusion and skipping ways past similar, but more obvious answers. Like a storm knocks down a tree into a lake and the tree sinking to the bottom of the lake preserves for fossilization. We don't need to assume earthquakes and global floods. Also, especially as we're talking about dinosaurs knocked over trees all the time, and I'm sure they could have knocked some in lakes too.
It's not that they were sitting there for millions of years of time, or that they got buried in local, small events. A tree is an organism just like any other biological organism in nature. It's all biodegradable material, and it will break down over time if not quickly protected. And those layers formed quickly around these trees and were thus able to protect the trees from decay and deterioration.
So why is any other solution not okay except Matt's one? Matt's denying the answer or ignoring them and presenting a less likely scenario with much less evidence. And that's even if we can really claim it supports Matt's idea at all.
Noah's flood is what caused all of these fossils to come into existence.
No, it didn't. The Bible isn't a science book. At best, it was people's ideas about God, telling stories they believed were divine. I'm not going to look at the worst ideas of what the Bible could be, though. I'll let the comment section speculate on that if they like to.
You have to have rapid burial for these things to even be preserved. There is no question about that. Noah's flood is a fact of geology. It's a fact of history.
It is not a fact. It is quite literally impossible for a magnitude of reasons.
You can put your faith in it. A lot of people say that you can't trust the Bible or you can't trust the book of Genesis. Well, they'll go around saying there's more than two genders. Think about that.
This one I always find funny. It's like he cannot understand non-binary people and therefore they cannot exist. What gender is God again, Matt? Just to be clear, I am aware of the answers usually given. I don't truly know what Matt would say, and if he ever watches this video he'll probably sim what I say about it. But the answer given is an attempt to avoid being non-binary. That would be, God isn't bound by human concepts of gender, or that God doesn't require gender, or God is the combination of both, therefore there's still only two genders. Fair enough, I will accept all of those. Here's what non-binary means regarding gender. Non-binary, meaning not identifying with only one single definition, is an umbrella term for gender identities that aren't confined by the gender binary of woman or man. Non-binary people might identify with no gender at all, or more than one gender. So, let's have a look at those God concepts again. God isn't bound by human concepts of gender. Wow. Non-binary meaning not identifying with one single definition. It's not a human concept here, it's just basically saying it doesn't go by the concepts of man or woman. So, big tick on that one. God doesn't require gender. Non-binary people might identify with no gender at all. There you go. Another big tick. God is the combination of both, and therefore there's still only two genders. Non-binary people might identify with no gender at all, or more than one gender. You know, like man and woman, like God does. Another big tick there. It doesn't matter how you put it. Non-binary people are simply not the standard binary of man or woman. If God is not a man or a woman by any identification, then God is non-binary. Matt believes in a timeless, spaceless being that is described as no gender and /or both genders. Now, I bet he's fine with the crazy timeless and spaceless part, but the gender of God is so incredibly important to get specific about, despite not being able to comprehend God. Isn't God all-powerful? Couldn't it become a third gender if it wanted to? Not non-binary, not man, not woman. Couldn't it become a different gender completely? Because, he's omnipotent. Surely it should be easier for theists to understand this concept. But if not, why not? And how do you know what this non-dimensional being wants? It's almost like it's about what makes assholes feel better about being assholes rather than actual truth. Go figure.
You can't trust them to get advanced geology right when they're not even correct about basic biology. They're so clueless about almost everything. God was right. Mankind and the wisdom of men is often very foolish. But God was right, and this shows us that we can trust God when he said that he flooded the world, and that he will judge the world in the future.
It's getting a bit awkward when Matt's saying we can trust God while arguing for the point that argues against him in this. How in God's name can we trust either my version, a being that doesn't exist, or Matt's version, a being that tried to kill us once already? We also can't trust God for other reasons. If my father had me as a baby with a married woman, then had that woman's husband killed, what do you think would have happened to me as a baby? Well, the Bible says the child doesn't bear the sins of the father, so I should be fine. But I think actions speak louder than words. And according to 2 Samuel 12, God would have punished my father by doing nothing to him, letting others sleep with his wives, including the new one, and making me, as a newborn baby, sick for 7 days before I die. So, what I'm saying here is, even if Matt is correct about God, I don't even trust that God around any living creature, and I'll do anything to protect my kids from that evil monster.
This has to be, in my opinion, one of the best pieces of evidence for Noah's flood. If you look at different mountain ranges, you'll actually see that they are made of bent rocks. What's going to happen if you were to try and bend hard rock? It's going to break it. The only way to be able to bend these layers and make them perfectly bent as you move up is if they're all moist and soft simultaneously. And this could not have been the case if millions of years of slow and gradual geologic change was causing the landscape to morph into these positions. The rocks would have crumbled and shattered and broken. They would have eroded flat by gravity. These mountains wouldn't even exist if millions of years of time existed.
Wow, you have the answer already, but have been told a basic understanding of why it wouldn't work. If you apply a lot of pressure very quickly to a metal spoon, it'll break. But if you apply pressure slowly and increase that pressure, that metal will bend instead. But you just have to remember one thing. There is no spoon. The movement of landmasses are going to be slowly applying much greater pressures over much longer periods of time. I can understand the question of why here, sure. But from Matt here, at this point, it just feels like intentional ignorance.
And this one is pretty cool because creation scientists tested the chemicals in these rocks. They tested the rocks at the peak and also the rocks at the base and many in between, and they found that the chemical analysis of the rocks came back as being identical. If you're finding the same chemical components in all of these different layers from top to bottom, that means that all of these layers are the same age and that they were laid down in rapid succession during the flood of Noah.
First off, don't get me wrong, but I don't think I'll be trusting creation scientists. It's like science, but instead of admitting we don't know to find answers, we start with an answer and look for evidence. However, we already mentioned that strata is usually straight, but not always, as land is pushed higher or lower, which in his image he shows the strata lines, if that's what these are I'm not a geologist either, are curving directly upwards at the ends. So even looking at it, I would predict to find results that would make them the same age. Now, I realise those creation scientists actually know what they're doing. They use real science to predict things that they can then use to figure out where's best to find the answers they want, and however to avoid finding the answers that don't confirm what they believe.
Look at this mountain. All throughout it, you see different folds and bends in the layers that cannot be explained by slow and gradual shifts in the Earth's crust. Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin would have had us believe that these layers slowly accumulated and that these rocks would have bent into these positions slowly over time. These mountains would not even exist if evolution were true. They would have eroded flat because of gravity.
Gravity is a part of our environment, and the environment is part of what guides natural selection. But I want to be clear, Matt doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. How can a mountain's existence depend on evolution? That is what he said, right?
These mountains would not even exist if evolution were true.
I had no idea that Darwin's theory of evolution included mountain formation.
And something that's similar to a polystratifossil but not quite the same, but still worth mentioning, is these dinosaur tracks that we're finding that penetrate all of these millions of years of geologic time. The only way to get a track that's preserved is if it's catastrophically buried and then protected. Think about it. If I was to say that there was a track of any animal, we'll use a dinosaur for example, since that's what we're looking at right now. And let's say it puts its foot in the ground, makes a track. Okay, well, that's going to get smoothed out over just a few days most likely, or even a few weeks. Rainfall will erode the track away. It will smooth it out. It will make it so that it doesn't exist anymore. These dinosaur tracks, which we're finding in strides because they were running from the flood.
This video has been the best comedy I've watched in a long time. Again, Matt, remember, I know many talk about the dinosaurs' extinction event killed all of the dinosaurs, but that doesn't mean that dinosaurs were immortal until the asteroid hit, or the Great Flood somehow affected their immortality. Dinosaurs had been dying all throughout the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous period. In fact, there was also an extinction event during the Triassic period that didn't wipe them all out, and they thrived again for millions of years after. It's like he's watched the film Day After Tomorrow and said, "Do you know what this film is missing? Dinosaurs."
Were obviously protected quickly by sediments, crashing down on top of them and sealing them into place. The way that evolutionists answer this is really laughable, because if you look at this photo, this is how they explain tracks that are fossilized. They make it look like the dinosaur was just trying to take a dive into the ocean. Well, even if that were true, what's going to happen from the water hitting those tracks? As the water moves, as the waves hit the shore, and you have the undertow going, it's going to knock out those tracks in less than a day.
Yeah, sure, if you use that bad example. But what about swamp-like areas? And I'm sure there are many examples of where it would work and where it wouldn't. Matt's just presenting the answer, strawmanning it, and providing his answer, which is pretty much the basis of pseudoscience, especially of his. So I don't know what I was really expecting here. What makes it worse is that when talking about the flood, he understands that a fossil needs to be preserved in some way, like rapid burial. But anything other than the Great Flood, he assumes the fossil is impossible because now suddenly it couldn't have been rapidly buried. This is why fossils are rare. The conditions for fossilization are not the most common thing out there. But now imagine if the world were completely flooded, a complete rapid global burial. Why isn't most of everything the same age? And why isn't there tons of evidence of it?
But according to evolution, it takes at least 10,000 years for a fossil to form.
Matt really needs to look at what the theory of evolution actually is. Fossils, sure, are evidence for evolution, but the study of fossils is paleontology. Evolution is not the study of fossils. Paleontology provides evidence for the theory of evolution.
So they expect us to believe that dinosaur tracks in water were lasting underwater for over 10,000 years to be able to be fossilized.
And you expect us to believe that a global flood did it in much quicker succession. And don't even start with that rapid burial stuff here either. That works for both of us. If you didn't use it in your straw man, you can't use it now. Sorry, my channel, my rules.
And one of the greatest places that we can look at to demonstrate the flood of Noah as being true is the Grand Canyon. Because if you look at the layers of the Grand Canyon, if you were to break them apart, you'll find that there are water ripples connecting some of the layers. They're fossilized trace remains of water ripples shooting through the layers. That means that it was water that laid down certain of these layers at the Grand Canyon. There's very little erosion between the rock layers.
Doesn't minimal erosion here work against you, Matt? You know, since this was a giant global cataclysmic event to basically sterilize the Earth, except those aboard the Ark, of course. As for the fossilized water patterns, then, well, you know it's not actually water that's been fossilized, just the effects of water on the ground. Water ripples are the effect water has on the floor beneath itself. The sediment with the pattern is compacted and essentially turned into rock. However, if the waters were chaotic, don't you think it would have disturbed that pattern? Because rapid burial wouldn't allow it to remain intact, to be fossilized. It would have been more of a gentle burial, most likely. It seems like Matt is presenting evidence against his argument, but making out that it makes sense for his argument instead, and hoping that no one notices.
Think about it. If you have a layer forming, and then for millions of years, nature is taking its toll on this land, it's going to erode it. It's going to weather it. It's going to put marks into the land. Well, you don't really find much of that between the layers. What that means is that the layers are all the same age.
The Grand Canyon partially formed because of tectonic activity, which allowed the Rocky Mountains to form, which also pushed up older strata. The river eroded away the softer rocks, making any rock formations or strata layers left over more denser at the surface, otherwise the river would have eroded them away. So we're not going to have much weathering erosion after the easier to erode areas have already been removed. As for the layers' ages in the canyon, I have no idea why he thinks they're the same age, other than the lack of erosion, that he claimed but was wrong. If there are many answers and one is very different to the rest, it's probably wrong, but worth investigating why it's wrong. Why isn't Matt wanting to do that, I wonder? Oh yeah, because the wrong answer gives the answer he was looking for. Just in case you're interested still, the strata of the Grand Canyon dates around 200 million to 2 billion years old.
In the Grand Canyon, we find salamander tracks 15 million years before we find the salamander that made the track. The reason that this is because the salamanders were obviously trying to run up through these sedimentary layers as they were forming, and they were not able to outrun the mud that was coming in and covering them, and they died in the upper layers, not able to outrun the mud. We also find trilobite trails 15 million years before we find the trilobite that actually made the trail. What that shows us is that trilobites were also trying to run up through the mud. They were not able to escape it, and they were all buried catastrophically together as well.
If there was a section of strata pushed up, just like how the Grand Canyon formed, and then there was a layer of sediment over that, it could fossilize through the strata layers kind of like a new strata layer, which is why strata is a good indication, but not how we age things. Unfortunately, because Matt only gave us images and no specific examples, there's nothing I can really do to look up the actual age of these fossils, where radiometric dating would have been done.
And on the UCMP's website for paleontology, they state about the tracks that if these impressions are covered with sediment before being washed away, they become preserved as fossils. One of the common findings that creationists will mention is that we find dinosaur and man tracks in the same layer. If dinosaurs and man lived millions of years apart, and if these layers are millions of years of different ages, you're not going to find a man track and a dinosaur track in the same layer of hard rock. In this layer, you find the dinosaur track on top of the man's footprint. And what I find interesting about this one is if you look at the middle toe of the dinosaur, it shows that it actually stepped over a human footprint that already existed in the mud before this had solidified. While I was in a debate with Dr. Kenny Rhodes from Reasons to Believe, he looked at these fossils and said that it was likely that there was a creature that had a foot that looked like a man's foot.
While many people you debate would have been able to answer that better, why did you choose this guy's answer as an example? Is it because he's got a PhD so you can call him doctor as an authoritative example, who gave a poor answer? Dr. Rhodes earned the PhD in theology and philosophy, and Doctor of Ministry, Historical and Biblical Theology, and focuses on the topics of the arguments for God. Now, that's not to discredit Dr. Rhodes. He at least as far as I could find, acquired his PhD from an accredited university, Texas Tech, which is more than I can say for your friend Kent Hovind, and I can only assume Matt as well, based on his Abeka educational upbringing. At least Dr. Rhodes tried to understand that dinosaurs and fossils are not his area of expertise. It'd be like me asking Matt to accurately answer questions about Islam. My answer would be that you're assuming the dinosaur foot was after the human. But why assume that at all? If the human foot came first, the dino foot imprint would still have gone through like you said. But if the dino was first, the human's foot wouldn't have reached the bottom anyway. It would look the same in both scenarios. But this is pointless anyway, just look at the foot of the dino. This is kind of like a cartoonized idea of a dinosaur's foot. The rounded heel and toes don't match any other fossil that I've seen, but they do match dinosaur feet in cartoons. I cannot find anywhere that gave this any credibility at all other than creationist websites. A perfect example of Matt trying to make an answer fit his story, rather than finding evidence and building up from there. He'd even rather use forgeries than any real evidence if it works for him.
And really, I feel like that's just a denial of the blatantly obvious evidence that we're looking at here.
Ironic, coming from the one presenting evidence in the form of generally accepted forgeries.
Obviously, we're looking at a man track and a dinosaur track in the same rock. We also find fossilized traces of water ripples, fossilized raindrop prints. I mean, how long are these surface areas going to last before they get smoothed out by nature?
And how long could they have lasted in a global flood that was able to rip trees out of the ground with their roots, like Matt said earlier, and was able to throw dinosaurs and embed them into the ground? Bravo on the storytelling, by the way, Matt. If I wasn't able to look up this stuff and actually think about what you've said, then you may have had me.
Obviously, they had to be sealed quickly in order to be preserved. That's the only way that you get these fossilized remnants of raindrops, tracks, and water ripples.
And a chaotic global flood is the obvious answer to all of these fossils. Is Matt really certain there's no other explanation? Like, at all?
And the Bible tells us that the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And atheists for years have laughed at this. They think that it's absurd that there were 40 days and 40 nights of rainfall during the time of Noah's flood. But if you were to type in "reigned for millions of years,"
those reigns of millions of years was billions of years ago. None of those atheists must have been English if they're laughing at 40 days of rain, because I can confirm from England itself that it has never stopped raining here. Just a joke in case anyone is confused, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if 40 days of rain could actually happen. We just laugh when you say that it was a flash flood that towered over all mountains, and they were saved by a wooden boat.
Here's the first thing that pops up. It says that time that it rained for 2 million years. Atheists believe that it rained for 2 million years. But they will declare that the Bible is false, that God's word is not true because they think it's insane that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah, Matt, that's not the reason. It's because you claim a God exists. We say prove it. You give evidence. We inform you that the Bible isn't evidence. You ask what evidence do you want? And we say we want to see God or its effects. You say God is timeless and spaceless, so we couldn't see it or interact with it. Then we wonder how the f*** you have then.
What I'm about to share with you is probably the greatest argument that supports Noah's flood from geology.
You've said that already, and it failed.
In the earth, you find gigantic 10-mile thick pieces of cold rock that have been subducted, parts of the crust of the earth that have been subducted into the hot mantle of the earth. Remember, the mantle is molten rock. Why is there cold rock that has been subducted into the molten mantle of the earth that is not heated up with the other rocks yet? The only way to explain it is that in the recent past, the crust of the earth was broken up, and that plates were moving under one another, and 10-mile thick pieces of rock got subducted down quickly into Earth's mantle, and they haven't been there long enough to become uniform with the temperature of the rest of the mantle. This means that Noah's flood has been confirmed from geology, that if something like that was to take place right now, that it would shake up the entire planet. We wouldn't be able to survive if this sort of event took place today.
That's not cold rock. It's still incredibly hot. It's just presented as blue because it's cold compared to its surroundings of hot mantle. And that rock certainly does not confirm that God spoke to Noah to build an ark and save all the animals. Then you also state we couldn't survive it today, but Noah did it on a wooden boat. We have entire armadas from many nations that could survive the same thing as that wooden boat. Our species would be devastated, sure, but that's a reason not to trust your God. So we could survive unless God destroys the universe because of a tantrum, which to be honest, I wouldn't put it past God at this point. None of what Matt is saying is helping me to believe in the flood or Noah's Ark, let alone God, let alone the God that caused it, and most certainly making me adverse to worshipping something that can commit such evil acts.
And so if these cold rocks are still cold, which they are relative to the surrounding temperature in the mantle, then it means that they have not been there that long. And the only thing that could have put them there was rapid moving of those plates. And the only thing that could have caused rapid moving of those plates was a breaking up of the plates and rapid subduction that was caused by God allowing the earth to be destroyed by a flood.
Oh, so he does know that it's relative to the surroundings then. Then he must also know that the process isn't fast or rapid. Should I say for objects like parts of the Earth's crusts, of 10 miles like Matt said, are incredibly large, and not only is the surroundings trying to heat it up, but the object is trying to cool its surroundings. It's like cooking a frozen meal. Do it too fast, and well, it burns on the outside, but the center is still frozen.
The flood of Noah happened. There's no doubt about it. The evidence is clear. You can either choose to accept or reject it.
I reject your claim, Matt. It doesn't even come close to an explanation.
But I will say that if you doubt the Bible or you doubt the authenticity of the Word of God, just simply look at the evidence. What does the evidence tell us? It shows us that God has proven himself to be correct.
No, he hasn't. And the Bible literally cannot be correct. Just check out the Skeptic's annotated Bible online for the many contradictions in the Bible. This video is long enough, and that topic would take far too long to cover. The rest of Matt's video is just Bible talk and backhanded threats of fiery pits of hell and trying to discredit scientists. If you want to give any recommendations for me to take a look at, then join my Discord. There's a section for feedback and you can recommend videos there as well. So thank you greatly for being part of this channel. I hope you enjoyed the video, and there are 2 more on screen right now. Feel free to select one and I'll see you there.